All right, let me bring in my guest this evening, former federal prosecutor David Katz. David, thank you so much for being with me this evening.
Great to be with you, Michael.
All right, first and foremost, big question of the day. How do you think he did on the stand?
Well, I think that he was in a desperate situation, I think his alternative is to be convicted without any doubt whatsoever. So I think that he felt that on balance, this was low risk and maybe some reward that his story would be believed. What makes his story so incredible, what makes it such a bombshell, which I think just blows up in his face at the end of the day, is that he never told this story at the time. And yes, he's going to say he was scared because he was illegally in the United States. At the very least, he would have been deported. You know, this is the argument why people don't come forward and report crimes, because of our skewed immigration laws that actually could make the victim deportable. And so you don't want to report, you don't want to be a witness. I get all that. I think the jury on one level will get all that. Having said all that, that he didn't report that two strange people came along and made him participate in this crime of theirs and dispose of the body in this way, that he would never tell this to the police. There were so many things that could have been done at the time, Michael, to corroborate it, to look for those people, to see if there were strangers in town, to go to the other potential suspects' houses. It just is incredible that he did not tell this story to the police. He didn't give even an inkling of this story. This is why criminal defense attorneys always say to their clients, don't talk to the police in your own self-interest, because obviously it's in his self-interest, putting aside justice to the victim and everything else. It's in his self-interest not to be convicted. And it hurts him terribly that he talked to the police and that he never mentioned this story. They're allowed to bring that in, that he never mentioned that story, and argue that it's a recent invention by a desperate man who's about to be convicted of murder. And so on top of being an alleged murderer, he's going to be found by the jury to be a liar. Take that risk, he decided. That's my interpretation of what just happened.
Yeah, I felt he had nothing to lose. I mean, we were all talking about whether he would take the stand. I always thought it was the best thing for him because he didn't have a terrible background, and they had the statement they could definitely impeach him with, but at the end of the day, it was, like you said, very low-risk situation. But I also thought that if this was really about his children, when they asked him about how many times he asked about whether they were safe, he said only once, and they wouldn't give him any information. If this was really about his children, you'd think he would really hammer that point home. Let me talk to my wife and child. Let me talk to, well, the mother of my child, and he just didn't do any of that.
Well, Michael, there's only so much that you can do to prepare a witness. And I don't think that his attorneys did anything wrong. I think that they tried to bring out what he wanted to say. I don't think that they, encouraged him to say anything that wasn't true. I'm not saying anything like that whatsoever. At the end of the day, commentators like you and me, we take a look at it. We see how persuasive was the testimony, because there have been so many. I used to be a professor of law. We taught the Christian burial speech. We taught all of these situations where you think, okay, how did the person get into this situation? What were the legal remedies? As you said, was he going to be impeached with things that he'd said before? Was he going to be impeached with a prior record? Was he going to be impeached on the fact that if he was so concerned about his kids, how come he didn't mention his kids more than he did? And those were all things that he'd said in hours and hours of questioning by the police. And most of it, the police were able to get in. Some of it they weren't, because they actually didn't Mirandize him properly in Spanish, which is sort of mind-boggling. For what it's worth, the translator was very good in court today. I'm bilingual, and I was able to listen to his testimony, which he gave in Spanish, not the questions that were asked of him that were translated in his earphones. But the translator was very good. And I thought that he was, relatively persuasive as a witness. I mean, there are some things, if he'd have been my client, he would have shaved that beard off, or I would have jumped up and down and up and down. But his mannerism was kind of what it was. I thought he could have been better prepared to answer some things like about his kids. But I thought in general, he did about okay. I think he's going to be convicted anyway.
Yeah, oh, no question about it. I mean, the stories, really, neither one of them make a lot of sense. We'll get into that when we come back. Right now, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, all right, still with me is former federal prosecutor David Katz. And David, I wrote down while that cross was going on, it was tepid but effective. I thought they were going to go after him much more ferociously than they did. Love to get your thoughts on the cross-examination of Christian Bahena-Rivera.
Well, it didn't look like Perry Mason. They didn't have the great music playing, right? He didn't approach the witness. He didn't even stand up. But I think it was quite effective because he brought out some things that just really don't make any sense. How did these two men arrive without a car in the middle of where this guy lives, out to his trailer in a rural area? How do they get there without a car? Doesn't he notice later on there's some car tracks, there's some anything? How does the man get here? Then on top of that, he's taking a shower with his door unlocked in a trailer. That also doesn't make any sense. Why do they need him? The question was objected to, but I think the jurors are thinking, why do they need him? Why did they choose him? Why do they think that he's going to not run straight to the police after all of this happens? And so to me, this just comes across, Michael, as a story that doesn't make any sense. In our system of justice, we allow the defendant to go last. There are other systems of justice that may not do that. We allow the defendant to sit there, not even make an opening statement if he or she doesn't want to, make it at the beginning of the defense case or not make it at all, and then testify last after all the defense witnesses have after all the prosecution witnesses have testified and all the exhibits have come in. And so people would worry if you just looked at our system, philosophically, from another country, you would say, well, doesn't that perhaps lead to defendants being able to lie, to make up a story that's dovetails with all of the things that they've now seen and heard in the courtroom? And the answer is that a skillful prosecutor can pretty much, they pretty much deal with that, as I think this prosecutor did. And I think there's going to be a rebuttal case. I'd be stunned if that investigator Romero doesn't take the stand and they don't pick apart even more what inconsistencies there are. By the way, one thing I would like to know is, where does the daughter live? How old is she? Where does she live? What are her circumstances? Maybe that's come out at some point and I just missed it. But that doesn't make any sense at all, that he wouldn't say, yes, go protect my daughter. I'll tell you my story, but go protect my daughter. He doesn't say anything like that. And like I said, his story just doesn't make any sense. It seems like a very recent concoction.
Yeah, and quick question, because I'd love to get your answer to this. I thought perhaps the defense didn't even know exactly what story he was going to tell. And I say that because if this was the story that I knew he was going to tell, there were a little different cross-examinations that I can envision doing that this is a very competent defense team. I'm sure they would have done. So I'm wondering if you get the sense that perhaps they didn't know either that he was going to take the stand or that if he did, that this was the story he was going to tell.
Well, one of the key decisions in a case, and one that the defendant is allowed to make and not his or her defense attorney, is whether to take the stand. I think that this defendant wanted to take the stand. Once he wants to take the stand, you try to prepare him or her as best you can, but there's only so many hours in the day. Obviously, he's in custody, so I'm sure that they did it as best they could. They've probably gone over his version with him several times. But you do have to be careful. I mean, you can ask questions that are going to help you prepare the testimony. Obviously, you have the rules of ethics. And so you have to always be wary of that while zealously defending your client, including with regard to the client, Michael, who wants to take the stand, which I think that he did. And like I said, I just think that his story does not make any sense. I think it tried to fit between the cracks of the testimony that had been presented up until then. But the fact that he talked to the police and that they can use a lot of that against him now, even if they couldn't use it in the case in chief, they could use it to cross-examine him once he decided to take the stand. I think it was all fraught with peril, but of course to do nothing was fraught with huge peril. I just think it was absolutely certain that he was going to be convicted if he hadn't taken the stand.
Yeah, without taking the stand, he had no chance at all. And I thought it was interesting that in neither version does he actually say he saw what happened to Molly Tibbetts. So that points to maybe he just doesn't want to acknowledge what might really have happened. All right, stand by. And as you heard, Ulysses Felix's parents worked alongside Bahena Rivera at the dairy farm. And the mother of Molly Tibbetts allowed Felix, a high school student at the time, to live at her home when his parents left town. But does all this help Christian Bahena Rivera's story add up? Does it paint a reasonable doubt and point the finger at Dalton Jack, who does have an alibi and denies having anything to do with Tibbetts' disappearance? All right, let's talk about it with my guest, who's still with me, former federal prosecutor David Katz. Now, you discussed this a little earlier as to how did they make the connection between Dalton Jack and the defendant in this case, and there is a way that I think the defense was trying to do it. And if you look at a possible boogeyman in this case, as we call somebody we want to point the finger at in one of these cases. Dalton Jack seems like a good candidate. He lied. He was called a racist. He cheated. He admits to having anger problems. He was even upset at Molly around the time of her disappearance because she decided not to move in with him. So he sounds like the kind of guy you'd want to set up, but you still have that problem of the forensic evidence.
Well, you certainly have the problem of the forensic evidence. You also have the problem that it's very difficult for two people to go do this and two people to both keep their mouths shut. If you really believe that Jack was furious enough, and he was the one who was cheating, she wasn't the one who was cheating on him. So you have to get into that really would be his motive to kill somebody, that he was two-timing her. So the guy who's two-timing is going to go decide to kill her, and he's going to bring a friend along. Why? If all he wants to do is to threaten this guy, the defendant, and have him go along out to this cornfield and know that his girlfriend jogs, and so he's going to go kill his girlfriend, and he's going to lay it off on this Hispanic guy because he's a racist. And they didn't ask him specifically, by the way, are you anti-immigrant? Are you anti-Hispanic? Racist could mean a lot of things. That was probably as much as they thought they could get, and they were happy to have that in the record from the young lady who testified. But it makes no sense that Jack would do that with a second person. Of course, by concocting a second person, that leaves somebody to talk and say, oh, go ahead, Jack. It all seems so improbable. If there were any foundation
David,
to this,
let me stop you there, because the second person is possibly his brother. His brother took the stand, and he admitted to having knives in the home, and he is a little burlier and a little taller, fits the description as mentioned by the defendant in this case. But before you go on, I want to ask you this. You know, the defense, I would imagine they knew that this story was coming. They've also still pushed forward with this theory that there were perhaps others. You know, we heard the story of Ron Pexa. We heard some other DNA found at different places that wasn't tested, these other possible boogeymen who might be involved in this crime. Do you think that was wise on their part, or should they have just focused in on perhaps one theory?
Well, Pexa wouldn't fit because he was 6'7", and no one's been described that way. So I think that, no, they look like they're clutching at straws. I think you're very right. If they had a particular fall guy, they should have laid it off on him and his brother and had that thing. By the way, people don't run around if they're two brothers with the last name Jack and call the other one Jack. That doesn't make sense. But if this were really credible, one thing he would have done is he would have said, look, the guy who came into the courtroom 2 different times and the way he moved, that was consistent with the way that one of those people moved. I mean, if you're going to go for it, go for the gusto. Say, wait, that body language, that looks like the way that that guy moved. Now that I see him in court, oh my goodness, I'm starting. That was the man. That was the man.
But they actually went the other way. They went the other way. They said to him, "You're not saying that it was Dalton Jack that did it," and he was like, "No, I'm not saying that," which I thought was interesting.
And now that was interesting. It was counterproductive. If you're going to, as I say, if you're going to go for it, go for it. I could not understand why they asked that question. I guess they thought it just looked too pat to the jury. But like I said, if you're going to present it, present it. And that's the defense that their client wanted to present. And he was presenting it. I did think that calling the young lady, the young Hispanic lady, that was effective. And I think their investigator got to the bottom of that, and they were presenting that. I think that made some sense. I think that your instinct that they shouldn't have been looking like they were clutching at straws, that didn't really make any sense. I think the jury is going to think they're clutching at straws, and this Jack, you know, he's also got to have a lying alibi witness. If he did it with his brother, then somebody is lying to alibi him. That doesn't make any sense. Would he lie to the investigators because he was doing something he shouldn't? He was two-timing somebody? Of course. And he was two-timing the girl who ends up the murder victim. So it's very understandable to a jury why he wouldn't have been straight with him, this Mr. Jack, and yet he's not the murder suspect.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far this story is actually going to get him. Lee Painter, thank you so much for sticking around. David Katz, always a pleasure to have you. I'm Michael Ayala. It's been a pleasure being with you.